Hi everybody. Yes, it's still cold here. I think this is some kind of like polar vortex or something. Although I will say we're not actually doing as badly as our friends down in Texas. The situation there is pretty sad. And it's not, it's not because people in Texas deserve anything. It's just because their infrastructure wasn't prepared for this kind of freak weather. And unfortunately, I think it's going to keep happening. And I don't know, my heart goes out to the people in Texas. And apologize for not posting this earlier, partly because this is about my 4th attempt to try to make this video, but also because it's been a really rough week for me. I've got an eviction hearing on March 1st, so wish me luck. Fingers crossed that I'm not going to get evicted. And there's some things going on in the horror community that, I mean, it's Black History Month, it's Women in Horror Month, and of course that's going to bring out all the 4chan trolls. And it astounds me how fragile generally white men, but white folks are when somebody else tries to do something or get ahead. It's so disgusting. So I suppose I should explain what happened. Last week, Dr. Chesia Burke and another Black woman horror writer were reading on a Zoom conference, and a bunch of trolls decided to just show up and start screaming gendered and racial slurs at them. And one guy decided to masturbate on screen, as if that's some kind of threat. And I mean, the whole thing is just disgusting. You know, if you're that person that thinks that that's appropriate at any time, you can go fuck yourself. And if you think that that's appropriate because of the person's race or gender, double fuck yourself sideways. Go crawl back under your little 4chan rock, you fucking troll. Speaking as a white person, you don't speak for us. That is not who we are, and that's not what we do. Even just for the sake of courtesy and manners, never mind anything else. Never mind politics or identity or any of that stuff. Just pure manners. Like, what is wrong with you people? And then the other thing that happened was Gabino Iglesias, who's an acquaintance through Facebook and Twitter. We've shared a table of contents a couple times. We had a joke about, sorry. Yes, I am at work. That's why the headset will probably be on and off. So, yeah, I've shared a TOC with Gabino a couple times. We have jokes about riding each other's coattails. And, he's a really cool guy. He's probably one of the hardest working horror writers out there. So last week he was the recipient of a Horror Writers Association diversity grant. So again, another white male. Like, are you guys okay? Really? Decides to take it upon himself to say that Gabino was, what was it that he said? Whiter than the snow he consumed before he worked out. And by the way, Gabino is also a bodybuilder, so he's very, very jacked. I would love to see somebody say that kind of crap to his face. Like, really. So, I don't get it. Who decides if somebody is white enough or brown enough or not brown enough for a diversity grant? Like, go fuck yourself. Really. Sorry, I got distracted there. So then, to make matters worse, Gabino and some other writers were reading at an event called Noir at the Bar. It's been an ongoing thing for a while. And again, the Zoom trolls decided to show up and start, just slinging bullshit. And when is this nonsense going to stop? Like, what purpose does it serve? How does it benefit somebody to do that? I don't get it. I mean, I get it as a white person. I understand that white people have benefited from white supremacy. I understand that we have to acknowledge our own racism before we can move forward and, just be better people and build a better world. But how does it benefit anybody to be an asshole on a Zoom call? I just don't get it. So my review today is Beloved by Toni Morrison. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about how so much of American culture is built on the fact that they never really got over the Civil War, and about how much of their legislature and fears and culture were built on this little group over here wanted to own slaves, and this bigger group said, no, you can't do that, but we still need you, so we're gonna kind of write the laws in such a way that we still make allowances. And it's just never been better. It's just never gotten any better in terms of race relations, in terms of the specter of slavery. And at this point, I don't even know how it's going to change. I don't know. Maybe there are some Black historians that can add to that, but just my little observation is, it's like when you have an abscessed tooth and it hurts, and then the tooth breaks off and it stops hurting. But if you've never dealt with that abscess and that infection, it will get everywhere in your body if it's not stopped. And I think that that's American culture right there. Civil rights were the tooth breaking off, but the rest of it was never, ever dealt with. So, I don't know. It's very hard for me to talk about racism coming from, I'm white, I'm Canadian, I don't have the lived experience. I could never imagine going through the kind of stuff that we see in Toni Morrison's Beloved. I can read it, I can feel empathy, I can feel just incredibly sad for everything that's been lost. And that's only half of the novel, and I think that is an important thing to look at as far as just reviewing the book. So, spoiler ahead. The book was published in 1987, won the Pulitzer Prize, and Toni Morrison has always, in her writing, she writes beautifully. I love her writing. But she never ever shies away from the darkest and scariest elements of human behavior, especially when it comes to race and in just so much indignity. And the story is about a woman named Setha who escaped from slavery. She escaped a slave plantation in Kentucky, and she went over to Ohio, where her mother-in-law lived. And her mother-in-law, her son, Holly's husband, had bought her freedom. So she lived in Ohio. And when Setha escaped, she had just been absolutely brutalized. She couldn't go back to the slave plantation, and she was out of her mind, basically. And a month into living in Ohio, the white plantation manager went to retrieve her, and she couldn't go back. So she intended to kill all of her children and herself, but she only succeeded in killing her daughter. And we start with the daughter is a ghost that's haunting the house where she lives. And what's interesting about how the ghost is created is a lot of stories, ghosts represent tragedy and trauma and grief, but there's often a question of if they're real or not. In this book, there's no question at all. Ghosts are real, everybody believes in them, and it just rattles around disturbing everybody. So Paul D., one of the men who lived on the plantation with Setha, shows up one day and gets rid of the ghost. He says, get lost, and the ghost goes, and they don't hear from it for a while. So they're living together, and they're kind of uneasy but content. They go to a carnival, and then this mysterious young woman shows up, and she calls herself Beloved, which is the name that was engraved on the tombstone. So Seth's daughter, Denver, believes that Beloved is her sister. Come back, come to flesh. And she's there to live with them again. And Paul D doesn't like the way that Beloved looks at him, and he starts, getting really uneasy and moving around the house, and he just ends up leaving when they sleep together, and which is, by the way, a really not unsexy scene. And so then Beloved sort of takes over the household, and she just keeps taking and taking, and she's eating all their food, and Setha has sort of lost herself in this girl. And another one of the neighbors shows Paul D a clipping of what happened when Setha killed her daughter, and Paul D's like, no, that couldn't possibly be her, but it was. And Paul D, or throughout this, we sort of get the backstory on each of the characters and what they went through after they left the plantation. And again, each character has their own ghosts and has their own life, and some of them sort of gave into them, like Setha's mother-in-law, and then some of them, like Paul D, managed to, I wouldn't say he's overcome them, but he is a very, very strong person. Some of the most brutal scenes are the ones where he escapes from a chain gang. It's just scary. So, as the story goes on, finally Denver, she realizes she's starving, and her mother is probably gonna just not gonna give herself over entirely to Beloved. So Denver decides to go out and start looking for food, and she wants to work, but the neighbors start giving them gifts instead. And eventually she talks to this woman named Ella, who says, okay, well, you can come and work nights where I work, which is like taking care of this lady. And it just so happens that the family owns the house where Setha and Denver live. 124 is the address. So Denver's sitting outside in the dooryard. She's waiting for her new boss to come and pick her up. And the townswomen start to gather. They're like, there's something really weird going on in that house. Let's go and investigate. And so they all start to converge, and the white owner of the house starts, sets out, and they all get there. There's about 30 women in the dooryard, and they look out, and Setha and Beloved come out, and Setha sees the white guy coming, and she loses her mind again. And she, rather than trying to kill Beloved this time, she runs and tries to kill him. And the women, they stop her, and that's basically the end of the book. And then Paul D comes back, and it's through love and redemption that she can start to heal from all of the trauma of her past, and of losing her daughter, and all of the terrible things she had to do to survive. So that's the basic plot. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of themes of family and motherhood, and what can be done to break a person, and how incredibly violent and terrible the white slave owners were to their slaves. They didn't treat them like human beings. It was worse than animals, worse than, I just can't imagine treating anybody like that. And not having them rise up and kill you one day. The fact that guy was still alive at the end of it is pretty impressive to me too. And it's a really difficult book to read. It's a really challenging read because it's so, just so tragic and so awful. And you get the feeling that, as horrible as the things that Toni Morrison can write into a book, it's probably only a tiny little bit of the worst of what any of these people experienced, and that's even more tragic. And So I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. My only criticism of it, I mean, obviously it's a good book. It's an important book. It's not supposed to be an entertaining read, although there are little places in it that are just, I mean, so much more delightful than they need to be. And there's even a joke at the end of it. I mean, after all of this, there's Stampede and Paul D are talking at the end of it, and Paul D says, or no, Stampede says, what, she gotta kill someone every time a white man shows up at her door? And Paul D's like, yeah, good thing she never gets any mail. And I mean, comedy being tragedy plus time, that was so unexpected and so funny. It ends on a hopeful note, and I appreciated that about it, because it could have very easily just have thudded and just been so awful, but it wasn't. And the ability of these characters to heal is also really wonderful to read. Once we see just how they take little comforts in colors and you know, companionship and things that anyone who isn't undergoing all this stress and trauma would overlook. So I think that's all I have to say. It's loosely based on the story of a woman named Margaret Gardner, who did the same thing. But Toni Morrison also was looking at the specter of slavery and how this trauma affects people who, you know, who had to live through it and then had to somehow create a normal life after all of this terrible stuff happened. So there are much better criticisms and analyses of the book than I could ever give you. I just my you know, my review is, I liked it, go read it, it's important. But certainly I recommend Crash Course in Literature, and Thuglit did a nice little review of it. And I'm sure that I'm sure some people have written, you know, papers and papers about it. It's an important book. And, you know, I was really sad when Toni Morrison died. She's one of my all-time favorite writers, and The Bluest Eye is also another one that I really liked. So go read it. Enjoy Black History Month. Maybe try to find something less awful. I hope you're reading lots of great horror. Have a great day.